All right, welcome everyone to today's Pursuant webinar. I'm seeing attendees start to join, so if you're just now jumping on, welcome. We're excited to have you. Today's topic is the second in our Major Gifts series, and the topic of today's webinar is measuring major gift success in 2020. What to measure when you can't visit prospects. So the overall topic today is, at a time when the typical metrics that we look at to measure our success in how we are, whether or not we're getting an A in our job, those look a little bit different. So we want to look at some ways that you can actually track your wins at a time when it's difficult to track maybe some year-over-year metrics. Moving on to the next slide. Few logistical pointers here. So you can use the Q&A box that's located in the bottom toolbar of your Zoom screen to submit any questions that you have. We will be recording and are recording today's session. So if there's anything that you miss, or if you have to jump off, or you wanted to share this presentation with a colleague that couldn't make it, we will be sending that out via email tomorrow, and we'll be posting it to the website within a few days. So you can always look for it there if it somehow misses your inbox. Next week, we will be concluding this series with webinar number 3, and that will be adapting your case for support and major gift visits in the new normal. And that'll be at exactly this time, 12 noon Central next week. So I hope you have that marked on your calendar, and we'll be sending out a reminder email to everyone to sign up for that one if you haven't already. And then in 2 weeks, we're going to be, we've got a special guest joining us for our webinars, and we will have Reggie Rivers, who is president at the Gala team, and also a former NFL player who's just an amazing speaker. We love anytime we get to partner with Reggie. He's going to be presenting a guide to adapting your adapting your galas and events in light of this new virtual world that we're in. And this is not part of the major giving series, but we think it's a topic that ties in really well. So I also would love for you to keep that marked in your calendar for 2 weeks from now. All right, I am excited to introduce today's speakers. First, we have Doug Cogswell. And Doug, I will let you introduce yourself and Kristen, and go ahead and get us kicked off.
Yes, thanks, Leah. So I'm Doug. I founded a company called Advisor Solutions, which is now part of the Pursuant Group, where I'm the EVP of Strategy. And we've done a ton of work in data analytics and major giving fundraising, and specifically in this kind of era, what to measure and what to do when visits may not make a whole lot of sense or can't be done. And we're going to try to take that up to a higher level performance drivers. What should you actually be measuring? Kristen?
Hi, everyone. Kristen Priest here. I'm Vice President of Strategy at Pursuant. I get the privilege of working with several of our clients, primarily in the major gifts and capital campaign space. Before I was at Pursuant, I worked as a major gift officer, primarily in higher education, both in a very large fundraising program with teams and teams of major gift officers, as well as in a small nonprofit where I was the single gift officer. So I can appreciate the challenges and the opportunities in both of those scenarios. And somewhere along the way, I also got a master's degree from the Indiana Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, with an emphasis in understanding those variables in high-performing major gifts programs. What are those factors that go into creating teams that excel in both that efficiency and effectiveness that land in that end result of the optimal major donor experience?
So I'm going to take more of the data geek analyst approach at this, and Kristen's going to complement me with more of the human side of this, and how do you actually do major giving in this era. So I think the combination is going to be pretty powerful. I'm going to start out talking about what to measure. and then visits versus meaningful contacts. We're going to go into some detail on what that looks like, because you'll see in the data that visits, which has been a primary focus, may not actually be as impactful as having a meaningful phone call or an online meeting or even a meaningful email dialogue. So we're going to talk a bunch about that. And then Kristen's going to come in and talk about how do field officers, major gift officers, actually perform in this new and next reality, because things have changed and they're going to stay different. And then we're going to talk a bit about moving from activities, which is what measuring visits has been, it's field officer activities, to a real focus on performance drivers. So to the extent you measure activities of field officers, it's very different than measuring the cultivation, the development of the actual prospects. How are they feeling? How are they moving? How are they related to your cause? And then discussion and Q&A. And we're going to be, just put the questions in on the chat, and we'll collect them. Leah may jump in along the way if there's a pertinent one as we're talking, or we'll have time at the end. So getting right into it, we kind of, Chris and I were talking, and we like this thing. The elephant came back. So let's start about the room where it all happened, because the elephant has been, for some time we've been talking about the visits, which has been the primary measure. You'll see some data on that of what major giving teams measure, has not actually been the best measure, and it has not produced the best results. So this elephant came back, and he's in this room, and I think one of the topics is, it's not just visits right now, it's visits going forward into the future. How should we actually be approaching our prospects in the most effective way, and what's the best way to look at how they're being cultivated and developed? So that's sort of the theme for today. Make sense? So this is the data geek side of this. We looked at the data, and you'll see it's going to go progressively into more detail. But first point is number of visits never actually has been the best indicator of whether a meaningful interaction actually occurred. So we see a lot of, when we read the field officer comments in databases on visits, suppose it was, I bumped into Bob at homecoming. So if you bump into Bob at homecoming, Bob is probably not most eager to have the dialogue with the gift officer. He's trying to meet his classmates and professors and so forth. So if there's no more content on this than I just bumped into Bob, this probably wasn't moving Bob along as a prospect. And we've actually had a bunch of one-on-one interviews just sort of probing on this, and that's, it's just the content is really not there. When you read the notes on the phone call, spent 90 minutes on the phone with Sue and got her verbal on a $100,000 gift to the engineering school. Clearly that's meaningful. We moved, Sue progressed, we got next steps. So this was the kind of interaction you'd like to have versus I just bumped into somebody and I recorded a visit. And then we dove in further. The role of a visit really varies by stage. So if you take, 4 stages: qualification, early cultivation, mature cultivation, solicitation, and close. I know you all have different numbers of stages and call them different things, but for now, let's stick with these. In qualification, a phone, email, or an online meeting generally works well to get things started. I mean, you're trying to get an interaction. You're trying to get to a meeting. In early cultivation, we find the visit is the most important, and this is from looking at lots of data, because you're trying to sell the concept, and that happens much better, in a over breakfast, lunch, in a conference room, at the prospect's office, at their home, because you're trying to get below, okay, yeah, I like engineering, I appreciate what you're doing, to, hey, we've got a major fundraising campaign to increase the engineering school, and what are your actual interest areas? How can this be shaped, and how can we best engage you in what's happening here? And you want to get the part of the campaign that fits into the prospect's interest areas. Then what's interesting, we then looked at mature cultivation. Visits get less important, and in the solicitation and close stages, trying to visit may actually hurt, because these prospects, potential donors, are busy. They're not necessarily eager just to sit down and have a lunch or a visit. So we actually found that teams that use effective phone, email, online, and these later stages actually had quicker movement through the stages and were more effective than ones that try to measure visits and drive visits across all these stages. So this was we didn't expect this. We were looking at, okay, what about visits versus other meaningful contacts? But we realized it varies a lot by stages, and there's some real lessons learned here. Then,
and Doug, let me just jump in here. There's some interesting research that draws the same correlation. The research happened to be focused around events and when is the right follow-up after attending a gala, for example. And too often the team organizing those events said, well, hey, they just came to this event. We don't want to bug them. We don't want to bother them. So they allowed this long gap of a few weeks to go before they contacted. And what the research showed is they called it a mountaintop moment. There's this mountaintop high emotional, excited stage that a prospective donor was in that lasts for an event, it was about 72 hours before that decline started to happen. And I think we see the same thing at these different stages. In the early and the mature cultivation, by the time they're in that mature cultivation, they have a passion and an excitement and an energy, and they see the vision of what their gift is going to accomplish. And when, as gift officers, we create this long delay because we think we have to do a face-to-face ask, especially if we have to fly out to Phoenix or, pre-COVID, we would need to travel somewhere. The weeks and sometimes months, it not only delays securing the gift, but it can deflate the donor's energy and sense of urgency around that. We almost have to recultivate to bring them back up in that place to be ready to make a gift again.
Yeah, great point, Kristen. And then going beyond that, and you'll see some of the data in a minute, successful teams go well beyond field officer activities, visits, and interactions, and work with more strategic performance drivers, and we believe there's 5 of them. They include making sure the right prospects are assigned and the portfolios are reasonably sized, and typically for major giving, this is 75 to 100 prospects per field officer, and there's a bunch of data on that we'll talk a little bit about later. The second is the portfolios being connected with, penetrated in a reasonable period of time. So if I have 100 prospects, the expectation should be I can have a meaningful interaction with 60 to 65% of them, and I ought to be able to have some connection with 80% of them. You're not ever going to connect with everybody because some will qualify out, but we often see, and you'll see examples in a minute, where field officers have had a connection with 40, 50% of the portfolio, which is 40, 50 people, but not all of them. And actually, we've also seen that if you measure visits, you could do a lot of visits with a few people. We call that over-visiting. So we have had situations where field officer does 80 visits in a year, but he does 10 to 12 visits with 4 people each. So they've got 40, 45 visits with 4 people. So you get the visits, but you don't actually get the portfolio coverage or penetration. So we feel this is a much better way of looking at how the portfolios are being mined and managed than looking at the activities that go behind it. Then the third is stage balance and time and stage. And we'll show examples of these a little later, but so you will often see imbalances. So some field officers are really good at qualification, and they'll clear through the qualification stage really quick. But then they get the prospect to mature cultivation, and they're not as good at soliciting the prospect. So the actual prospects hang on that stage a long time. Others are much better at solicitation, but aren't so good at qualification. So you'll see with them, they've got the qualification prospects in stages a long time, but they're moving them from mature solicitation to mature cultivation, solicitation, close pretty quickly. So understanding these balances and timings are really helpful, and if they're used with teams, we've seen just conversations happen where the field officer who's good at cultivation and solicitation stages helps the one who's not, and vice versa. And maybe it also can do some team alignment. Maybe some field officers should be really focused on qualification, or in sales you call that business development team members who are trying to figure out who are viable prospects, and then the people who are good at developing and closing cover this. So there's a series of things that come out of this, and you'll see some examples in the data we look at a little later. The fourth is, are we asking the right amount relative to capacity and attachment? And the goal here is, say I have 2 prospects, each with a capacity of $1 million. And one of those prospects is disengaged. They've made a gift of 5 years ago. I've never been to an event, came to a reunion 10 years ago. $1 million prospect, that might be a good leadership annual giving. Maybe a $15,000, $20,000 ask would be appropriate. They have the capacity, but they're not attached or engaged to the cause. Another $1 million capacity prospect, my other one, is an owner. They're on 2 committees. They've been to 6 events in the last year. They've given every year. They've been to all their reunions. That person, $1 million capacity, maybe it should be a $300,000 or a $400,000 ask. So the asks need to be tailored, and teams that are really effective are looking at those relative to the attributes of the prospects and having discussions about it. I mean, you at least want to have the discussion, because the one that should be $20,000 in leadership annual, if you try to ask a couple hundred, it's probably going to be a real stretch. Whereas the other one, $300,000 potential ask, and if you ask $20,000, you'll close it, but you just left a lot of money on the table. So this is a key attribute of trying to figure out how to maximize the revenue out of the prospect portfolios and help the team get to the point of that. And then the last one is close rates, also known as yield. You want to measure, of the solicitations, what's the close rate, and typically effectiveness, if we're asking at the right level, are 8 to 10 major gifts closed in a year, which is basically a 25, 30, 35% close rate on the ones that go into solicitation. And that's sort of our benchmarks there. So we're going to talk about the visits, meaningful contacts, in some detail next, and then come back at the end and talk about more about these performance drivers. Chris, I'm going to let you jump in, and if there's, or Lee, if there's any questions at this point, we can hit them now. Otherwise, we're going to kind of progress through this content.
Sure, Doug. We had one question come in around donor experience surveys. So what part does a donor experience survey play in a major gift strategy, and how many organizations are taking advantage of this kind of this approach?
So I'll answer, then Kristen, you can jump in. As we're looking at, so I'm the data side, right, the data geek, attachment. That is generally a mathematical model that's trying to figure out somebody's connection to your cause. And any survey data that's available, whether it's an alumni survey, a donor satisfaction survey, a hospital patient satisfaction survey, there's a bunch of surveys where people are expressing connection, expressing interest. That is mineable data that can be stripped out of the survey and integrated with other data from the CRM and turned into part of an attachment score. And then a modeling tool is going to weight the survey expression versus the act of giving in the last couple of years and coming to events. So yeah, we love that stuff. And in every case, there are ways to pull data out of surveys and then use them with the rest of what you've got. Kristen, any more on that?
Yeah, I think first I agree with you, Doug. I think donor surveys and just that concept of building that dialogue with donors is a critical part of major giving strategy and really the entire fundraising program from the bottom of the giving pyramid up. And something that is some of the, I think, challenges I see is that sometimes it's a one-time deal and we've checked that box versus a system or a process that where donors are continually invited to that dialogue. And that's everything from the new donor welcome survey that invites feedback around understanding what aspect of the organization is most important or they're most passionate about, kind of validating and affirming what the data can tell us. And I think the other piece that's important is sometimes as we build out surveys, I think there's a cautionary tales around collecting information that is interesting versus actionable. If we want, especially from our major donors, the richest information, I think we do have to be cautious in making sure we aren't over-surveying or we aren't asking information that, again, it's just interesting to know versus helping craft a strategy. And then, of course, that final piece is if we are going to ask, especially our major donors, anything about their experience, their connection, their passion, I think it kind of goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, just making sure we absolutely hear, adhere, and apply what they are sharing back with us into informing the strategy. But that's a great question, and I think a really critical part of successful major gift programs.
Yeah, good question, Kristen, and good thanks, Kristen. Leah, any more questions at this point, or otherwise I'm going to kind of move on here.
Yes, I've been reading through them, and some of the questions that have been asked, I think we're going to get to later in the presentation. But I think I'll go ahead and pitch this one, and then maybe we can address some of the other ones a little bit later. But this was sort of a two-part question around visits. So Stacy asked, when you say trying to visit may actually hurt the close, is it because we wait too long, or is it because we wait too long to get a face-to-face visit? And then also kind of the second part of that is asking for a major gift over Zoom or some other virtual channel. Is it actually insulting to the donor?
Yeah, let me respond to that personally, and then let Kristen come in. So for me, I've been solicited for a variety of things, and to sit down and talk about the cause and understand what's happening and why it's important, and I can then back and forth describe my interests and how it fits. That's the early cultivation where you're trying to sell the content, really important. And then at some point, it's like, how's the gift going to come in? How are we going to sign off on it? You know, where the assets come from, all that stuff. You know, you're getting into like, how do we get this thing actually over the line? If a field officer wants to come and sit down with me on that, that's going to be harder for me to agree to than picking up the phone and talking, or this. I'm like an email guy, so for me, you're better off just, hey, I have an issue, boom, I'll answer it. You know, here's 2 more issues, I'll answer it. So I just know, like, people who are going to make these larger gifts generally are very busy, and having, you know, additional visits depends on the personality. So I'm one end of a spectrum probably. I'm a people person, but I've got lots of other stuff I'm doing. So I would fit into this camp where you're going to make it harder to get the ask closed if you're trying to visit with me versus just quickly clearing through questions, issues, and emails or phone calls.
Yeah, I think that's a great response. I think the only other thing I would add is that, you know, at the end of the day, the only kind of good answer, and it's a tough one, is it depends. There are some variables that data can tell us, that just gift officer experience and stage in the donor journey can inform around the ease with which you can make that ask. We're going to touch a little bit on this later today, and actually that's our webinar next week, is going to dive into a good deal of detail around how gift officers and how researchers can respectfully build a conversation that essentially gives that green light that the yes, we can have that ask, we can nail this down over a Zoom, a phone call, an email, or I'm someone that really needs to have a slightly different approach to that conversation. So we're going to really be unpacking kind of the soft sciences around how gift officers can, in this new reality, move forward in that progression with grace and permission at each stage from the potential donor.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Kristen.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit because we actually had a really rich discussion. We feel like they've done one slide. The next sort of go through some of the details. So I'm just going to hit them up. We've done a bunch of surveys and research on visits and what people measure. This is from the Drive conference a couple years ago, where we did a fairly systematic industry survey. We asked, what are you measuring? And 94% measure dollars raised in the fiscal year. I don't know what the other 6% are measuring. It seems to be like the key thing. You want to bring revenue in. Totally, that's an outcome. Then visits in the fiscal year was second at 60%. Asks in the fiscal year was third at 35%, measured that. Then a variety of other things. But these are clearly field officer activities. And then we asked, has this helped? Only 1 in 6 said measuring these things actually helped us improve donor performance. 30% said sadly no, too early to tell. A few actually said that measuring these things caused a decline. And when you read the comments, it was because we're trying to drive field officers to do 80 to 100 visits in a year, and they end up just jamming visits in with their friends to get the visit number, but it's not actually helping them move forward the other prospects they should be focusing on. So this was fairly broad data, and there's, if you want to check it out, it's on website here. You can get a whole report on this. And then, so we started thinking, okay, we never thought visits was the best top level measure. And what about meaningful context? Let's shift to that. So we started thinking, here's a visit, met at home for 90 minutes, validated interest. Is that meaningful? Well, we're using a text parsing tool that's one of our, part of our Giving DNA platform, and it reads that, it says, yeah, that's meaningful. Visit, lunch with Dean Miller. Yeah, they had a lunch with the dean, that's meaningful. Met at Alumni Club in Chicago. This is like bumped into Bob at the reunion. Generally, when we talk to people about what actually happened here, if there's not more content in the note, that's not meaningful. So here's a visit that's not meaningful. Here's a phone call. Addressed Bill's concerns regarding football, a necessary step to final camp reunion solicitation. Well, that certainly looks meaningful, and you can sort of go down. So this is what we realize is that these notes contain the content that would a reasonable person would say an interaction happened that progressed the prospect. So we've actually, in our work, in our analytics, shifted the game from measuring visits only to measuring meaningful contacts. And especially when we look at the context of the later stages, mature cultivation and solicitation, we feel this is a much better indicator of how the prospect's being progressed. This is a contact report. So this is what, most of you have systems that record, what type it is, the notes, so we can automatically parse out the notes. And here's an example of, in our tool, it's called Smart Automated Parsing. Looks at the contact reports, and it's flagging as meaningful. So it's got stuff about certain words, if it's short or long. So we do something about how long the comment is, realizing that if somebody types a lot of stuff, something probably happened. Sat with, here's words that will knock it out as not meaningful, attempted to, invited to a dinner, invited to a football game. No, that's not a meaningful contact. It's an invitation, it did something, but it's a connection, but it's not a meaningful contact. So this is something that we've worked on since COVID started, actually. We've now got this in at a number of clients, and it's really helping them untangle what actually happened. And it's in a system, it pulls from the CRM and updates every day and creates these flags that you can then work with. And what comes up all the time is, what if the field officers aren't putting the notes in the system? Short answer, if field officers aren't taking notes, you're missing valuable data. The longer answer is, and one of our clients, TCU, talked about this at Case 4 back before COVID shut down all the conferences in March. What they would say is, as part of the field officer's job is to capture the thinking, strategize about next steps, and the best way to do that is to type it down in the system. And that also gives the rest of the team the ability, like if the manager wants to see what's gone on with this prospect, you can read the notes and get a real sense. So, and they would say, 20, 25% of the job of a field officer is thinking through and figuring out next steps and summarizing what happened. So I know a lot of fundraisers think these contact reports, it's just you clicking it in or something, but we've seen some real best practices where getting good notes in the system is key to the whole development process. And if that's going on, then it's easy to parse out with this automated smart parsing to figure out, if it's fully effective or not. Now, Kristen, you've had some sense of this as well. You might just jump in here and add on to this.
No, I think you're spot on there. Again, working in both a large and a small program, one of those challenges that we experience especially is also the revolving door that too often happens in major gift program, and not just tracking and monitoring what's happening on a month-to-month, yearly basis within the major gifts program, but as there is gift officer turnover, just ensuring that richest information is available.
Yeah, good point. So let me take an example. So we're pursuant. in our Giving DNA platform has 11 templated fundraising solutions. We're going to look in major giving at major giving metrics. I'm just going to pull a few slides from it and show you where we use these meaningful contacts concept. It's hard to say, meaningful contacts concept. Here's an example of field officer goals. So, we look at assignments, typical portfolios. This would be a horizontal benchmark, industry benchmark, 75 to a 125. Vertically, this team is actually really well-balanced portfolios. Maybe a few of them are big. The next one was we swapped out what used to be numbers of visits in the last 12 months, and we really like the moving 12-month period because you can benchmark it and see production. We swapped in meaningful contacts in the last 12 months, and this is disguised data from a real team. We've done a bunch of work that 175 to 200 meaningful contacts in a 12-month period is good production. Now, some portion of that will be visits, some will be phone calls, some will be emails, but this would be the horizontal benchmark. And then this team, as we typically see, this is the vertical benchmark looking at the team. The top quartile is at that level of production. The rest of them are not, so there'd be some coaching tips in here. And Kristen's going to, in a few minutes, talk about some of how do you actually have these meaningful contacts. But this is a big example of where you would use it, and you get a sense of what's working and what's not. The other benchmarks we're going to come back to a little later. Yeah, this is sort of a historic one. We don't particularly like that one. Closes. So in a major giving program, I mentioned it earlier, 8 to 10. A major gift close is good horizontal performance. Vertical performance, again, the top quartile is up there. Dollars close, you clearly, this is, I think, it looks like $1 million to $3 million. Major giving team, clearly you need to clear 500 or 600 to get a good return on the field officers. Again, the top quartile is there. Open asks, you want to see, 20 to 30. The horizontal benchmark, the top quartile is there. So this is, we're looking at a snapshot of how a team's performing. We would then drill into individual field officers. We'll see that a bit later. Meaningful contacts in the last 12 months, we believe, is a key measure of production, but it shouldn't be the only, and we start bringing in more of these other attributes. And then typical contact reports. We swapped out, numbers of visits in the last 12 months to numbers of meaningful contacts in the last 12 months, and then we've got visits next to it. You can see there's more meaningful contacts than visits. You can then click on meaningful over here on one of these, this chart over here. So we're just looking at the meaningful contacts. So it drops the visits down to meaningful. And you sort of see out of in this case, the 3269 meaningful contacts the team did. Some were visits, some were phone, actually more phone than visits. And so this is, over the 12-month period. This is in the fiscal year, so these are other periods. But you're sort of seeing the range, and you're seeing that these meaningful contacts cross correspondence, on-campus visits, off-campus visits, phone, and so forth. So when we looked at the data, we realized that there are a variety of ways to have these meaningful contacts, and the reports we're now putting together reflect it. And then I think one of the key things is getting beyond visits. This is this whole concept of portfolio penetration. So this is we call a spine plot, but each of these bars are a field officer. And so Amanda Carrington is this bar here. Her width is how many prospects are in her portfolio. Let's say this is 100. Justina would be a little smaller. It looks like, here's one. Gretchen's a little bigger. But you then see the color is the dark blue. Amanda, that would be has an active solicitation and a meaningful contact in the past 12 months. So this is good. 25% of her portfolio is in solicitation and has been contacted. And that's actually best of breed. Some others are a lot lower. We might have some discussions about portfolio balance. But with Amanda, what this is showing me is you've now got the light blue. These people have a solicitation but have no meaningful contact. This is where you'd start using this data to drill in and explore those prospects. How, Amanda, can you have prospects in solicitation but you've had no meaningful contact with them? What's up? Good news is the green is she's had meaningful contact but no solicitation with another group. So she's up at like 60% here. Then you throw in the minor contact, she's up at the 80% target. So this, using the data like this can really help draw out stories about how the field officers are prosecuting, penetrating, working with their portfolios, and can drive the discussions on what really matters. So for Amanda, great job. I wonder about this group in here, which looks like, 10% of our portfolio. That's probably 8 or 10 prospects in solicitation, no meaningful contact. Also shows the gray are assigned major giving prospects who have no solicitation and no contact at all in the last 12 months. And you typically see this. The target is 80%, but there's a group down here that are running really low. So we'd want to drive in on, say, Michael Ortiz. It looks like he's, reaching half of his portfolio. What's up with the other half? And this should drive a discussion. We'll see a little bit later with Michael that the issue here is these are just, should be leadership annual prospects when you drill in. So the fact that Michael's only reaching half, maybe that Michael's a bad qualifier. In this case, if you drilled in, you see, no, Michael's actually pretty good at that, but the problem is these are completely disconnected, disengaged prospects that should not be in a major giving pool. So this chart starts teams asking these I wonder questions. I wonder why this is happening here. I wonder what's up down here, with the ability then, if this was live, to click and drill in on the different colored bars and get down to the prospect detail level. And the meaningful contacts are really the flag for understanding the connection points. Another way this can work is here's for a field officer. So that last one would be used with a team. A field officer gets something, you want to see, when the last meaningful contact was. You can click here, I'm going to, pick a city. I'm going somewhere and I want to find all of my mature cultivation, solicitation, stewardship contacts, prospects who have not had a meaningful contact in the last 6 months. So I click these bars and get them, these check boxes and get them. You can sort of see for this field officer, who is Don Bastilius, here's his list of prospects. Most of his portfolio has had a meaningful connection within the 12 months period. 24, less than 3 months, 3 to 6 months, 25 of them, and 39. So this is actually good. He's connecting with them. Some no. We want to explore those. But this is really helpful. Like if I'm going to a city or I'm calling people, I want to figure out, my later stage prospects who have not been connected with recently. I can click, get my list here, and then, go call them, email them, visit them as appropriate. So we've found, and we've just taken this out to some of our clients, field officer teams, and getting this kind of information is extremely valuable. And it's just here, it's just a, click, get the numbers. So this is some of the things you can do with the visits to meaningful contacts switch. So Chris is going to jump in and talk about, off of that, how can we best support the major gift officers as they navigate this new and next reality, and really need to focus on other ways of connecting with people and managing to these broader metrics.
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, so, in life, and especially in major gift fundraising, at least for me, I found it was really easy to fall into the business as usual. First, it worked. We've been successful and raised a lot of money, prioritizing donors through that same lens, looking at the same set of metrics to determine and predict gift officer success, and building our relationships the same way we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or more. And that desire to hang on to business as usual is understandable. We're dealing with donations in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars and sometimes a million. It's understandable and scary to try new things when we're dealing with gifts of that size. We know the tried and true works, but the challenge is that limits us and our gift officers, and achieving that breakthrough performance and the results for the organization are difficult when we are tied to how we've always done it, or how we've always looked at gift officer success, or the prioritization of our donors. But this is one of the opportunities I'm seeing right now in 2020. In the midst of all of the challenge and anxiety, I know many organizations and gift officers are feeling that we have this moment in time where we're forced to think differently, to engage differently with our major donors and prospects, and to really ask ourselves what's the best way to engage with them right now, and possibly in the future, versus how have I always managed these relationships. And it's this time, not because we're cavalier or just trying new things for the sake, but out of necessity. What's the expression? Necessity is the mother of invention. So challenge ourselves to reinvent or look at what the data is already telling us, what Doug has showed around the most effective ways to cultivate, solicit, and steward our major donors. And I like to think about major gifts in two ways, the art and the science of it. And so how do we equip major gift officers with the tools and information needed? What additional art and science is needed to be successful? So we'll look at the art first. Major gift officers, the really great ones, spend their careers honing skills, the ability to pick up verbal cues and nonverbal cues to kind of read the room. It becomes second nature and something we do without even thinking about it, which doesn't always serve us well when we're thinking about change or needing to think about a new way of engaging. So we're going to need to coach for a new set of soft skills to add to our major gift officers toolkit. And that starts with everything from as simple as getting the appointment. As a major gift officer, I can't tell you how many times I began my phone call or that email with, "We'll all be in your area." And it's an easy approach to setting that appointment. It's approachable, it feels friendly, and it's just, hey, want to catch up. But the downside is it can lead to some of those prolonged observations Doug talked about. It became an excuse to have that meeting versus a strategic conversation I was inviting the donor to have with me. And when we think beyond the face-to-face visits, when we anticipate a shorter or more focused conversation, we need to ask slightly different questions. Probably 10 years ago or so, I started asking really great major gift officers or folks who engaged with major donors what their go-to questions are. Well, 150 questions or so later, over the course of 10 years, I've got about 150 questions. And this is something we're going to dive into in a lot of detail next week. Talk through some of my favorite questions, why I think they're so powerful, the importance of understanding what's being said in response to those questions, and sometimes more important, what's not being said. So thinking now as a gift officer more intentionally and strategically about those questions, knowing those questions you need going in, and working without cues. In addition to simply the body language and the limited verbal cues, there are also all those cues in the room a gift officer can have. It's part of why I loved meeting in a home or office versus a restaurant. There was so much information the room gave me. It gave me these great hooks and connection points. But operating without the cues isn't impossible. And in fact, we can still operate with those cues. We just have to pick them up differently. It's not impossible. And in fact, as a gift officer, once I was able to identify strategies and ways to make that connection, I became a better gift officer for it. Which brings me to point B. Remember when I was forced to do the simple exercise of connecting with a donor and understanding that point B, it made me more focused in that conversation. And there's some great research. If you read the book Meet to Stick, Chip and Dan Heath wrote it. They think they wrote a marketing book, but I swear they wrote a fundraising book. And what they found is that you'll remember a disappointingly small amount of what I say, but you'll remember almost everything of what you said. And so what we have to do is think about, what do we want that point B to be? What do we want the donor to remember? And then work backwards from that to land on the questions that invite them to articulate our point B. And finally, I add this right now, initially due to COVID, but as 2020 has evolved, and as we're now facing other significant societal issues, I think it's important for organizations to seek to speak into or not current issues or situations. And this case for support isn't to say how you're solving the challenges of 2020, but rather to say how, in light of what's happening in the world around us, are you more relevant than ever?
Hey, Kristen, as you're talking, I'm thinking, give suggestions on, so I say we're running a team that needs to develop these new skills. Where can they get help, or what would you suggest to actually try to get this changed perspective to come to be?
I'm sorry, can you ask that again for me, Doug?
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, how would a team operationalize this? Like, how would they, are they coaching? Are there books on this? I know we do training on this. Are there other ways? How do you get this to happen?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways. First, at the end of this, you're going to see a continue the dialogue pop up. Would love to grab 30 minutes of free coaching and consulting. This is my absolute favorite thing to talk about. I also have, essentially, it's a white paper of all of those strategic questions. Every question I got that I've loved, I've collected over 10 years. Shoot us a note. We're happy to share that out. But I also think just there's incredible team wisdom. Have this as a point of conversation. There's incredible expertise that your team often doesn't realize they have. I think part of the goal in this, and especially as an organization, if you're identifying that you do need to move towards different metrics for success, different ways of looking at this, doing this together as a team, allowing people to feel their success, to think about, hey, never realized it, but this is one thing that always works for me. I just thought everybody knew this, so let me share what's working for me and why.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because you're saying, like, different people in the team are going to have different levels of expertise at strategic questions, working without cues, and can to cross-collaborate and share the best practices. That's a great one.
Yeah. All right.
Hey, Kristen,
so that's the art. Yeah.
Before we move on, a couple of people are wanting to know if you could repeat the name of the book that you mentioned.
Oh, it's my absolute favorite book. It's called Made to Stick. It's a bright orange book with a piece of duct tape across the cover. I heard them speak one time. They said that was the biggest fight they had with their publisher, is the publisher wanted it to look like a little Post-it. And they said, no, that's the exact opposite of Made to Stick. Duct tape is the thing that sticks and you just can't get it off. So Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath.
Awesome, thank you.
All right.
Well, we'll include a link to that in the follow-up email so everybody can go and get it for themselves.
Fantastic.
Yes.
All right. So let's move down and think about the science. Really, this is about embracing technology and leveraging our prospect researchers. I think this is where prospect research and that data can be an invaluable tool for us, as at least I know as a gift officer, I often fell into the trap of creating the self-fulfilling prophecies. And I think when we embrace the science, the technology, it can help us break that. And so everything from thinking about reprioritizing the portfolio. We sometimes prioritize as gift officers or label most engaged donors as who is most likely to take the visit. And that often results in what Doug calls the over-visiting. We are visiting the people that love a visit, but may not be the best use of our time, or the people who, even worse, are just too nice to say no, but don't necessarily want or need those visits. And we miss out on people who are really passionate about and have capacity and interest in giving, but at least pre-COVID, they had very busy travel schedules, they just couldn't connect, or like Doug, just preferred not to have those long face-to-face visits, and would instead have preferred phone and email. So we have an opportunity now to think differently about folks who will engage, who can engage via Zoom or email or phone. Also look at giving channels, such as folks who give through donor advised funds during previous sessions, and even in very regionalized economic downturns. That's where we saw the resurgence, was donor advised funds. There's a strong uptick. The science of the virtual visit, all of those components we talked about under the art, pulled together, there is a science to a virtual visit. There's actually quite a few YouTubes around how to have a Zoom meeting. So whether that's Zoom or phone, we need to understand the science of what that needs to look like and look at the data. Data can help us understand. One of those questions we got at the top was, How do we respectfully, is it okay to respectfully have those conversations? Data can tell us how comfortable they are living in those virtual spaces. If they prefer digital communication or phone, how much they live in social media. And again, that's another great place where when we only look at the data from how we as gift officers have behaved, we create these self-fulfilling prophecies. So external data and our prospect research partners can be wonderful resources for gift officers in rethinking and feeling emboldened to respectfully step out into some other forms of visits. Testing and optimizing. I think there's an opportunity to take a page from our direct response or annual giving teams. What we were just talking about, Doug, as teams come together and say, hey, I cannot get that appointment to save my life. Once I'm in that conversation, I'm dynamite, but I'm struggling here. And then someone says, oh, well, this always works for me. And so testing different things, optimizing, trying different approaches to getting those appointments. We don't have those defaults we always leaned on. I'm going to be in your area. I'd love to take you to. And finally, just simply making sure your teams understand and are comfortable with all tools at their disposal. This is the research that's available, understanding Zoom and video embedded emails, to all of those other outreach tools you can use. So understanding all the tools available to them really expands that gift officer toolkit. So these are just a few ways we're finding organizations are supporting major gift officers, where we're seeing the strongest early success. And if you're thinking about making this shift within your program, there may be opportunities shifting away from business as usual. How do you do that in a way that supports and does this collaboratively, avoiding judgment or sense of micromanaging? We've talked about a few of those ways. We know that major gift officer position can sometimes be that revolving door, and that can significantly impact a program. So it's important, not just in terms of making sure your team is successful, but making sure they feel empowered and equipped as they engage with donors in this new and next reality. And now Doug is going to dive a bit more into the detail and data around how we leverage data analytics to foster the spirit of collaboration in moving from activities to those performance drivers.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. And so far we've talked about visits in the current environment and how actually meaningful contacts may actually be more significant as a measure than visits. And we talked a bit through performance drivers. We're going to come back into that now a lot more. And Kristen did, I think, a great dive on, in this new world, how do you work in a world where you're doing more virtual, more online, more phone? What are the processes? How do you get people to come around and really perform well there? So this is the last part. We're going to talk about a move from measuring field officer activities to performance drivers. I'm going to show you some in a minute. So that's one axis. And typically today, people are measuring, we've done a lot of research, field officer activities, and the process tends to be one-on-one, infrequent meetings, and use the metrics as good or bad thresholds. So it's kind of like, hey, Mark, you're coming into the end of the fiscal year, you've only done 50 visits, you need to do 30 more, which drives Mark to do more visits, which, you know, the feedback would say, this is really, we call it tactical and inconsequential with most of the sector here. So if you move to performance drivers, though, you also have to change the process, because if you don't change the process, the performance drivers by themselves are going to have little impact. And what we really recommend, and Kristen was just talking about it with this whole transformation of the teams on how do you actually set up in this world, transparent team meetings, transparent teams, regular meetings where stories and best practices are shared. And this is not just about how to execute into a virtual meeting, but this is also about how do I improve my penetration level? How do I move prospects out of mature cultivation more effectively? And when over and over again, when you move the metric to performance drivers and change the process, we see strategic and transformative and empowering cultures. And what happens is we see revenue levels go up. We see revenue closed more rapidly and at lower cost. So this is like a triple win of revenue, speed, and cost. And clearly that's a good place to be. So we kind of high level talked about these performance drivers, making sure the right prospects are assigned, that they're being connected with, that they're being moved through reasonable stages, and they're being solicited at the right level, and the yield is appropriate, 5 of them. I'm just going to step through them. So you sort of saw this a little earlier. This is this spine plot on we call it penetration, can also be called connection. And we flagged that Michael Ortiz looks like he's having some challenges connecting with half of his portfolio. In fact, he's only reached 47% of his portfolio in the last 12 months, 56 with no contact at all. So the way you would use this, say we're in a meeting with Michael and maybe some of the rest of the team, let's drill in and see what's going on here. So you click on the gray, and here's a page, we just shifted pages to the prospects, to 56 who Michael has not contacted. There's a list of them here, and you can sort of see, this is a higher ed fundraiser, alums, so alums, spouse, parents, a mixture of things, wealth capacity, 500 to 1 million, most of them, not bad, some bigger. Attachment, and this is also known as engagement or affinity. 3 highly engaged, that's great, 1 engaged, 52 are disconnected. Last meaningful contact, nobody in the last year, most never. Last visit, the same. So let's drill in on this. You look at this in blocks. Here are 2 high capacity engaged prospects. They have a capacity of 10 million plus each. They're both highly engaged, and we love laying the data out. So there's a model that creates this score. But here's the factors. They're highly engaged because they've been on 2 committees each in the last 10 years. If this was active, you could click and see which committees. They've been to 2 events. They've given in 2 of the last 5 years, 2 of the 5 years ago, 6 reasons. These people have done a lot. So I'm going to, Michael, out of your 56, you've got to get to these 2. It looks like we have a projected dollar value, which is, back to when we look at solicitations, of $7 million, 10 million plus capacity, highly engaged. You got to get to these people. But look at the rest down here. Here's 50 disconnected segment B prospects. So these are the ones that have lower capacity and are less engaged. And these probably all ought to be moved to a leadership annual giving program to be further cultivated. They got some good capacity, but at this level, you know, they haven't been on committees, they haven't been to events, they haven't been giving to the annual fund, and they haven't been coming to reunions. Let's get them going. So this helps Michael because we give him some focus on the 2 that matter, and prospect research and he are going to work together in rebuilding his portfolio. Here's this concept of movement. So here we've got the portfolio across the team. This is the same team we were looking at before. We're looking at balance across the stages for everybody. This is a reasonable balance between identification, early cultivation, mature cultivation. And then this chart is showing the time in each stage versus the stage. And so you sort of look out here, there's a lot of people, prospects, each circle is a prospect, but been in cultivation over 18 months. You could say, I wonder what's going on there. We love these I wonder questions. You click it, and what happens is you've now got the 167 prospects who are in mature cultivation over 18 months. You see there's a heavy concentration here with Kathleen Mitchell. The color is just representative. You see that right there. It's not so much any of the others. So Kathleen has an issue here in her portfolio. This would be a great, rich discussion. And then you can drill in on that. This solicitation and yield, I'm going to hit it quickly, but here we click Michael. So back to the page, we clicked on him. He's closing pretty well historically last 12 months. His revenue is pretty good historically, but he's got a low level of ask, and his ask relative to the value of his portfolio is low. So back to his current portfolio is weak. It needs to be rebuilt, but he's got a couple of high capacity people he's got to progress, which would help these ratios. And here is where we're trying to look at those questions about across the portfolio, where are we, what can we do? So, you know, those things roll up, and here's, you know, as we close here, some of the benchmarks horizontal we've seen, how many in a portfolio, the penetration levels, efficient movement through stages, a lot of research behind this, 25 active proposals, ratio of the ask levels to the calculated expected value, and how many actually get closed in a major gift level in a year. And we find when teams use these with the right process is when they really get dramatically improved performance. So we're right at the limit here on time. Got a discussion in Q&A. I'm going to hit up this other resources. And there's also just, if you want to continue the dialogue, if you go to www.continuethedialogue, www.continuethedialogue.com. We'd love to follow up on any of this, and we'll give you a half an hour of free consulting just to help flesh out some of the issues, Kristen and some of her team members. So resources here to build further, and www.continuethedialogue.com if you want more detail. So Leah, we're right at the hour. Any parting questions, comments?
Yes, I think if you move to the next slide, we've got a visual of that link. Yep, right there, continuethedialogue.com. We had a lot of questions come in, and so thank you everybody for submitting them. If we were not able to follow up with you or answer your question in the webinar, we'll be following up with you via email after the fact. But I want to go ahead and wrap us up for today. We went 1 minute over, so I'm sorry about that, but thank you everyone who tuned in, and I hope that this discussion today sparked some thinking for you. And of course, don't forget to miss the final installment of this major giving series next Tuesday. Yep. Thank you, Kristen and Doug. And with that, I will wrap us up.